Hi, hello, and welcome. My name is David Ringsell, and I'm going to take you through a half-hour presentation via Zoom on SQL Server database administration. So we're going to go through some of the basics, really, and this is gives you some idea what would actually happen in a longer course. It's going to include looking at some slides and some descriptions of how to work with SQL Server, particularly using a development tool called Management Studio, and we'll also actually jump in the deep end and actually start looking at creating a database. So that'll take us about half an hour. I'm going to help us out by looking at some slides at the moment. So I'm going to be doing a screen share for that. I hope you can see these slides clearly and you can hear me clearly. Let me know if you can't. I'll talk about how we can communicate with each other in a moment. So SQL Server database administration, demonstration online delivery, 30 minutes. My name is David Ringsell. I'm a trainer, developer, and consultant. I've been using SQL Server for, well, actually for getting on 20 years. Makes you realize how old I am when I say that. So I generally don't like to tell people that. I've worked both as a trainer, working in many sectors, including database administration, database development, querying, also expanding out into SQL Server Business Intelligence, and a range of cloud-based platforms as well. I also work as well as with SQL Server and database platforms. I work with applications, including coding in C#, Java, and a whole range of other languages. During my journey as a trainer and developer, I've actually passed 14 Microsoft exams. So I'm MCSD, and I've got another range of Microsoft letters I can stick after my name, really. I mention this because it's possible that you yourself are thinking about doing an exam, and the course materials we're covering actually could be useful in preparing you for an exam. If you want to contact me, I've got an email address there, david@talkit.biz. So that's a brief introduction to me. There I am with my hat on. How are we going to work? Well, I'm going to talk to you explaining some concepts. You've got the slides in front of you, and if you want to take notes, you can. I will also go on to do some screen sharing, really. So I'll allow you to actually work with the software itself, particularly SQL Server Management Studio, looking through the menus, windows, and scripts on that. If you've got a question, just type it into Zoom chat, and I'll pick that up at the end. I won't be able to do it during the course itself. So we can pick up any sort of questions or comments like that at the end. And I also say do exercises. Well, we won't have a chance actually during our half hour because it's pretty brief. But as a preview of what you do on a longer course, which is typically a 5-day course, we do actually put a lot of emphasis on practical hands-on work. So we say practice and remember. At the end of each unit, there's a structured practical exercise which guides you through building databases, querying databases, backing up, a whole lot of stuff really. So that is an introduction to what we're working with. The next section is how we work with Management Studio, and then finally we're going to jump in the deep end and actually build a complete database from scratch. So what we want to do really as part of an introduction to database administration is to actually give the experience of thinking about way back right at the beginning, starting with a clean slate. How do I create a database? What are the properties I need? What are the things I need to think about? Things to do with perhaps size, file location, names, tables, structuring data, and that sort of stuff really. So I hope you're going to enjoy that. I hope you find this relevant. I'm pitching this pretty much at a beginner level, assuming that you have fairly limited experience using working with databases. So let's move on to the first unit of our 2 units today. So we're going to work with Management Studio. Management Studio is our main client tool. So what I suggest you do is just take a moment to look at that screen. And we started off with a simple kind of graphic, really, a screenshot of Management Studio. Anything you recognize? Any questions? So I'm going to go through this bit by bit, really, and this will serve as a a prelude to what we're going to do a little bit later on when we do actually open up Management Studio. Well, the first part, pretty familiar, I think. Menu options, toolbars, similar to other products you might have used, Visual Studio .NET Access, or indeed, Microsoft Office tools. Then we've got a series of windows here. You see that's quite busy. It's a bit like our dashboard. And this is a bit like, getting into a car for the first time and just looking at the dashboard of the car, looking at what's on the dials, where the gear shift is, and all that kind of stuff, really. So I'll go through briefly what these windows do. Top left, Server Explorer window will allow you to connect to the various servers. The key idea here is that you can use this instance of Management Studio to connect with multiple servers, and they can contain multiple databases. They could be on-site, they could be remote, or they could be up in the cloud, really. So a lot of flexibility and a lot of versatility here. Then as I go below that, going bottom left, we've got a window, perhaps you can read it, perhaps you can't. It actually says Object Explorer. It allows you to look at all the things in your database environment from your servers on downward. Obviously the databases themselves, the tables in the databases, plus a whole lot of stuff. More on that in a moment. Then we've got our query editor. This is the bit where you write the scripts. This is the coding bit. You actually write the scripts in a scripting language called T-SQL or Transact SQL. And at the moment, there's a short demo script saying select name, color from the product table. So all that allows us to do is run a simple query to get a couple of columns back from the product table. When I run the query, execute it, the results pop down in the grid I have below. And then finishing off, we've got Solution Explorer over there, allows you to classify your scripts into projects and solutions, and the properties window allows you to get some information, additional information, anything you want to look at. So what we're going to do in this section, our objectives are learn how to use Management Studio, kind of learn where it is and what you can do with it, increase our productivity by using that Object Explorer window. We can use that to explore and dig deep into our database environment, but also to create, add, change things, really. So it's one of the major components. And finally, in this section, we'll actually work with that query editor window to write some queries that can do stuff, really. So we'll do a bit of coding, a bit of scripting in there. Hope that makes sense. Hope you're enjoying yourself. So let's just launch into this from this point. So getting started, well, good place to get started is to look at all those menu options. Again, familiar, those are the menu options we have on the top in our menu bar: File, Edit, View, Query, Project. And you may want to, when you've got a moment, just skim through some of those. And then we brought up the Object Explorer window again. So you can probably get the impression that I'm putting a lot of emphasis on using Object Explorer because it is your primary tool. It is your primary, let's say it's your dashboard onto the complete system, really. And what sorts of things can you dig into? Well, I've selected my server at the top, that's highlighted in blue, but I've got all my databases. So database, servers, other options, other folders. And if you may want to say, well, what do we actually mean by a database? I mean, I'm sure you've heard the term before, but a database is the primary container for your data. It could represent everything a business does. It could represent everything a particular department does. At the moment in this server, we've got multiple databases available to us. So we can all see it. We can actually see them all actually working for us here. So I'm just seeing what's actually going on there. So there we go. That gives us some idea of how we're actually working with Management Studio. Okay, so I've just got my mouse pointer back. Sorry about that. For some reason, my mouse pointer disappeared. I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but I've got it back again. Now, looking at Object Explorer, I'm just going to reinforce that you can use it to look at multiple objects, and you can also use it to create, alter, and drop here. So anything you want to work with, you can actually create an instance of it, you can change it, and you can also drop it or delete it. So that is an option that is available to you from Management Explorer. You can either do that. By using the menu options, right-clicking, or you can do that using scripts to actually work with that. And we'll look at both ways in a moment. So very versatile. And working with a query editor. So what you can do with the query editor bit is the bit we just saw a moment ago. And you can display multiple code windows. You can format and edit code. You can create various scripts, and you can execute queries. So just reinforcing some of the things you've got there. If we look at our graphic on the bottom right of this slide, you can see that I've basically I right-clicked on Object Explorer and I've taken the script object option and I've said create to, and that's allowed me to basically create a script for creating something like a database. So a question that often comes up is, how about help? What happens if I get lost in this whole system? We've already introduced quite a number of ideas. You may find them, they may make sense to you, but there'll certainly come a point where you start to feel you have less understanding of what's actually going on. So you can actually get help using the F1 key. So that will take you into an inbuilt integrated help system called Books Online. So I found that very useful myself because there have been many situations where I've kind of got a little bit lost, and it's just helped to be able to actually use Books Online to get additional information on there. So the next bit we're going to attempt to do is have a bit of fun by taking a look at Management Studio itself. So let's look at the actual instance of Management Studio. So you can see, I pulled it up at the moment. I hope that you can see that clearly. There's not much to see at the moment because I haven't really brought up any query windows or any other windows. If you want to look at any of those windows I've mentioned, then you can pull them up from the view menu. You can see there's all these additional windows that I described earlier. For example, registered servers, it's up there, plus a whole range of other things. On my left, I've got the Object Explorer window connecting to actually an instance of SQL Server Express. And I'm going to pull down and I'm going to look at some of the databases I've got here. And you've got a pretty good idea of a range of databases there. So if I look at the Northwinds, that's the sample database provided by Microsoft, represents data contained in tables about basically a business that sells all kinds of foodstuffs, all kinds of food products in there. So if I was to open up the tables, quite sure why that's not happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look at my bookshop database. Let's see, I've got any tables in there. Yeah, I've got some tables in there. So that allows me to look at a whole range of information stored in that in discrete tables. So you've probably got the idea that your bookshop database contains a table for authors, for books, for orders, and so on. The tables themselves, if I was to open up a table, you'd be able to look at a series of rows and columns, somewhat similar to layout to a spreadsheet where you've got discrete rows and columns of data in there. More about that later as we start to create a database. So that gives us a look at Object Explorer, plus a whole range of additional features here. We can do many things like manage security, manage backups, monitor performance, automate administrative tasks, a whole range of stuff that can actually be implemented from here. Yeah. So that is my, my Management Studio really. If I want to create a query, well, then I click on New Query. And I've got a query window opening here. Of course, at the moment it's blank, and I can type something in here and execute it. So, for example, if I want to put in a basic script, let me point to a particular database. Let me go to my bookshop database, and let me look at what I've got in my bookshop database. So I've got an authors table. So I'm going to do select star from authors. So that's my statement. That's my script. I click on the execute button up here, and it runs that script and queries the authors table and returns the data. I've structured the script to return all the rows and all the columns there. So you get some idea of how that works. We can obviously be a bit more specific. There's a whole range of ways we can actually query, a whole range of options in there. But just to give you an idea, that didn't take very long, and that was quite simple and quite effective to do. So that takes us, really brings us to the end of the first unit, and now we're going to move on to the second unit. So I'm just going to do a screen share again onto my slides. Designing a database. So this will take us the next 10 minutes. We're doing really well for time. We can just about work through this comfortably. Again, working through some of the ideas here, and then briefly doing a demo, and then summarizing the whole session. So we're going to look at, in this section, defining entities, database objects, a range of actual objects we've got, particularly associated with a database table, system tables, and we're going to look at what we actually need to do to create a database from scratch in there. So that should give us some interesting options to work with. And we'll look at other options that we can actually work with on configuring a database. So what do we mean by entities, define entities? What we're doing is, if you just take a step back for a moment, take a deep breath, and use your imagination to think about where you're building a database absolutely from scratch. So your database is going to hold significant data about a particular domain or area of interest. So I've chosen the idea of, actually, it's a film studio that produces films. So what it needs to think about is the films themselves, the directors, the distributors, etc., etc. So that's your first step in the design process. You can actually isolate specific entities that you work with. Now, once you've done those, you can go into a little bit more detail and say that, okay, so we need a table to hold information, or entities as we're calling it, to hold information about directors. Tell me more about directors. Well, things like the name, perhaps the genre they work in, contact information, etc., etc. So those entities have attributes associated with them, which is additional information. That will map onto columns within a table. So our entities become tables and our attributes become columns. Final thing we need to bring in, actually a very important thing, is relationships. We all know relationships are important. Relationships can be difficult, but relationships are very significant. Now, in the world we're working in, our data is not isolated. We don't have complete, discrete, unrelated areas of information or unrelated entities. Our entities actually are related to each other. So, for example, that may sound a little bit abstract, but for example, we have directors and films. So we have a relationship in the sense that directors direct films, films have directors, and then we may want to classify that relationship into, well, I put down four terms down after the word relationship there. One-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many, really. So an example of a one-to-many relationship, well, you could say that one director directs many films. So many directors, one film. But you could also have the situation where perhaps films have, I'm sure this does happen, more than one director. So it's now looking like a many-to-many relationship. Using this notation, the infinity sign, or the 8 on its side, represents the many side of the relationship, and the 1 represents the one side of the relationship there. So I hope that's becoming a little bit clearer. We'll have plenty of time to work with this as we go on to the full course. And to start to round off on some of these subjects before we actually start to build our database, let's look at some of these database objects. We mentioned those a moment earlier. So what we've got here in this lovely graphic we've got up on the screen, we've got a representation of a table. Now, this really is an employee table. It's containing information about employees. And we've got, as we had before, rows with individual employees in there. For example, Eva, Jose, Angela. And you've got columns with specific information. A bit like, as I said, a spreadsheet, rows and columns of data. Indeed, you can use spreadsheets and, for example, Excel to hold data and to hold databases to some extent. So we've got our information here. And what are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to look at some of the things you can add on to that. Well, associated with the columns is a data type. So for example, employee number, empnum is an integer, that's a whole number. Our last name is a long string, our first name is a varchar, that's variable character, up to 20 characters. So all of that is actually displayed by associating a data type with the column. What else have we got? Well, we've got our foreign keys, our primary keys, and our check constraints. So these are additional, they're actually called constraints that we add in to our table to describe a bit more fully how we're using the data. The primary key indicates essentially how we can locate records and how we can actually query. So we've got, we're using the employee number as our primary key, and we will actually be sorting the table based on that primary key. Then we've got a country code. Well, the country code points to another table. That's going back to relationships and FR for France, SP for Spain. And then our final constraint here is a check constraint. Now, the check constraint simply restricts the format of data that you can put in a column. So for example, we've got X followed by, I think it's 5 digits there. So basically in our char6 data type, we've said, okay, we want to make sure that the data complies with these kind of constraints, this sort of formatting constraint there. Kind of makes sense, really. And finally, we're applying a clustered index on last name. Clustered index is a bit like an index in the back of a book. It allows you to quickly find rows in the table by looking up, in this case, looking up the last name. And final point I'm going to make on this before we start to round off is that you've got additional information in systems tables. These system tables contain metadata or data about data. So it's a bit like, I suppose, going back to the analogy of a book, there's the book itself with its content, the pages you want to read, but there'll be some descriptive information. If you, probably in the first few pages, there's things like ISBN numbers, publishers, and that sort of stuff. So in a similar way, perhaps, in fact, there's in a slightly more, there's certainly more data that needs to be maintained, more metadata that needs to be maintained around databases. So all of that is held in my system tables. So let's go on to actually creating a database. Now, when you do that, you need to specify a few things. It's a bit like, well, anything you really want to create, you need to think about some of the initial properties. And a database actually consists, in terms of its actual structure, 2 files: a primary file with an MDF extension and a log file or transaction log with an LDF extension. Now, when we go to build a file, we really need to identify names for those files, locations for those files. And then we also need to think about the size of our database, or the size of those files that will actually contain the data in the database. The reason we need to do that is that databases can, over the course of time, get very big. They can get a bit unwieldy, and we may need to limit the size that they work with, and there are options to shrink and compress and kind of reduce the size of databases, really. But initially, when we create them, we supply some initial maximum and file growth sizes in megabytes. And we can actually create a database using Management Studio by going to Object Explorer, and it's surprisingly quick and easy to create a database. You simply right-click on the database folder, click on New Database, tap in a name and some other details, and there you have it. You've created a new database. Alternatively, this is my recommended way, by the way, you can actually write a script to do that. And to write the script, you basically say, create database, and you supply some of those details, as you can actually see some of the names of the files. Again, we've got a primary file and a log file there, the size parameters, and we've also, in addition, we've got the location of those files on a particular path on a particular disk. So that will allow you the feature of creating a database. And what does a database actually look like? Well, again, we can say that there's two files, but we can look a little bit deeper into it, and we can actually see that there's the data itself, primarily structured in tables and indexes, is actually held in a binary level in these pages, so-called pages of data, and each page is 8 kilobytes wide. And if you put 8 of those together, you've got 8 contiguous pages that are put in an extent. So that's actually where the data is physically held on disk. Really, always a good idea if you're working as an administrator to have some idea of what your data actually looks like, and where it's located at a low level, at a binary level. So to round off, what we're going to do is we're actually going to have a go creating a database in the last few minutes and show you how easy it is. So I'm just going to say, right click, new database. I should in a moment get a dialog box popping up, and I'm just going to call this one, let's say we're going to call this one houses, because you're going to store information about houses in there. And if you'll notice here, there's some other parameters, initial size, names of files, etc., etc. I'm just going to keep those, and I'm going to click on OK. Okay, so it thinks at this point, it's always worthwhile when we go through these, taking a look at the things that can go. I made a slight mistake there because I actually clicked on the add button, easy to do, and that gave me a different row. So basically, SQL Server managed to was assuming I was going to add another file. Actually, I don't want to do that. I want to keep with the 2 files that I've got. So I'm going to keep that option, and I'm going to click OK. And you can see now that I've created my database houses. So I've confirmed that it's been created by looking at Object Explorer, pointing to it. I can then look at what's in there. Now, of course, I haven't really created very much. There'll just be some default options actually in there. And that really brings us to the end of what we want to work with really today. So we'll end up with a little bit of a summary and look at where we go to from next. I could have on that demonstration gone on to actually showing you a script to create a database, but that's an option that you could follow up after the course if you have a bit of time really. So we've had a really interesting 30 minutes or so. We've introduced ourselves, we've introduced the structure of a course, given you a preview of what we'd like to attend a real kind of working course. And we've also looked at a couple of chapters. The first chapter is taking a look at the primary tool we're going to be working with, Management Studio, looking at some of the windows and then focusing in on Object Explorer and the query window. And then we've rounded off with, finished off with the second unit, which is about creating a database and asking some big questions about how do we create it, where would it be, what do we need to provide, how do we need to configure it really. So that gives us a good starting place for further exploration. And if you want some information about further courses and a range of other things that we provide, do feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.